Hello there. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Good. I think I'm actually going to bin a large part of my talk. When I talked to Marianne a few months ago, she was interested in the fact that I work for the technical team in Historic Environment Scotland, and we have done quite a lot of studies on upgrades to traditional windows. But I think that's actually been covered very well. The technical science side has been covered very well this morning. And also Nick Heath, who's following on, who did work with us before, will also expand on part of what I was going to talk about. So what Marianne was interested in when I was talking to her was about what my actual experience of the subject was. So I'll talk about that more generally, which I think in a way is a more useful conversation or a useful way of talking about windows. So excuse me if I'm slightly jerky since I've binned part of this talk. Historic Environment Scotland used to be Historic Scotland. We might be going back to being Historic Scotland again. Many of you in here know us and have worked with some of us. But we're best known for the castles and abbeys that we look after in the same way as English heritage. But like Historic England, we're a statutory consultee for listed building consents affecting A and B listed buildings. And we get about 2,500 applications coming in a year. The total number of listed buildings in Scotland is just under 50,000. So 2,500 a year represents quite a significant amount of change to the listed stock. We also write technical guidance and based on a lot of studies on traditional practice and energy efficiency. So I work in the team that gives technical advice. Although I did work in heritage planning in Historic Environment Scotland for 26 years, my new role in the technical team is drafting guidance on sash and case windows, and I'm struggling with a couple of points in it based on my own experience, which I thought I'd talk about today, and what people are actually offered. This is the thing that Marianne was interested in when I was talking about it. So I'll just give some background to windows in Scotland and then talk about upgrades, which is what I'm advertised as talking about, but just the kind of pros and cons that I find of each of the types of windows. So just to give you this is a sort of picture of windows in Scotland as I know it. But it is a talk about energy efficiency. That's really at the core of this. And our position on energy efficiency was probably best summed up when we were approached by Create Streets a year or two ago. And they're a panel, you may know them, who meet in London, mainly concerned with sustainability. And they put forward points for discussion in the form of provocations. And the provocation they put to us was, we think that, do you think that listed buildings and traditionally constructed buildings should be exempt from the need to make energy efficiency upgrades? And when we thought about that, we didn't have to think about it very long because we've been working on energy efficiency and traditional buildings for about 15 years. But we started off by saying we're aware that we do have a harsher climate up north, but we have reservations about the idea of an exemption based on it sort of perpetuating the idea that listed buildings are cold and uncomfortable and hard to treat. And our experience from our research is that they shouldn't be those things, and that people have a right to be comfortable in their homes and improve the energy efficiency of their buildings. But also all the practitioners I've spoken to have said that in their view, the owners and managers of listed buildings need to play their part in addressing the climate and nature crises. So our work on energy efficiency is made in the context of very stringent emissions targets set by the Scottish Government. And this was essentially trying to achieve net zero by 2045. And we've already achieved 50% reduction in emissions since 1990. But in particular, the ones where we get inquiries coming to us is for owner-occupiers' homes reaching EPC Band C by 2035 and private rented properties reaching EPC Band C from 2025. Now, I'm not sure where we are on those now because the government recently rescinded its target of 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 in recognition that it wasn't really achievable. But in our view, we have to go on helping people meet EPC targets. And I know EPCs is a controversial area that we've been doing a lot of work on. So our technical team under Roger Curtis, who's no longer with us, but many of you know him, has fairly recently written this guide called A Guide to Energy Retrofit of Traditional Buildings. And we like to reinforce the idea that we're interested in traditional buildings, which tends to traditionally constructed buildings, not just listed buildings. And that, in general, means buildings largely built before 1919 with mass masonry construction. This guidance on the right here incorporates our findings from the previous 15 years of studies. And in the middle there is also Holyrood Park Lodge, which I know some of you have visited, which has been is in the ownership of Historic Environment Scotland and has been a guinea pig for retrofit upgrades, and we're now working on a form of heating. And the lessons we've learned from these really is for people to have a hierarchy. So just in the way Marianne was talking about looking at windows individually, start with the easy wins, and pick the low-hanging fruit, as it were, all the things that are cheaper and less interventionist to the fabric in order to improve the building's efficiency and see how it responds, and then gradually move forward. In that way, you have more intelligent decision-making. Not everyone can afford to take that slow approach, but sometimes one change can make an enormous difference. There isn't a presumption that anything in the guidance, this is technical guidance, so there's no presumption that anything in there doesn't require consent or will get consent. So we're keen to make it clear to people that the planning process and the technical process or process of technical guidance are two different things, but inevitably people kind of see them as one. And I think this has affected people's perceptions on upgrades. Most of our guidance now on windows is pretty old. Most of it was done in the sort of mid to late 2000s. I've sent Natasha links to the bulk of it. I think just remember to check the date on them. That's the reason why I'm working on guidance, new guidance myself. So just for the kind of a bit of a visual picture of windows and our approach to them, I think you'll all be familiar with the issues that we consider, the considerations, and we've heard a lot of them in the last couple of days. We're all aware of the visual contribution that windows make to historic buildings and to the wider historic environment. And we also recognise that they're part of the historic fabric. Whether or not they're original or historic replacements, we always consider them as having a value to the building. They're also very useful for dating buildings. It's one of the key things we always say. And here you'll see on the ground floor these lying pane windows that Charles was talking about yesterday, sometimes called Scotch glazing. And upstairs you have what looks like 1880s windows. And actually, from our point of view, that's useful because it draws your attention to the fact that this building was originally from the 1820s or 30s, this very short period when windows were Scotch glazing or lying panes were fashionable. And then the building was raised probably in the 1870s or 80s. And you can see the line in the stonework running along above the ground floor. Is that working? Yeah. So just in terms of early windows, many of you will be familiar with these kind of shuttered windows with leaded fixed lights above them that we see in 16th, early 17th century houses. I actually can't think of any original ones I've seen. I think I have seen one in very decrepit condition in a ruined tower house, but they mostly survive in restorations, particularly a lot done by Historic Scotland. And this is a restoration of Lamb's House in Leith done in the 1950s or 60s, I think. But normally they're replaced with sash and case windows. So in this case, this is lived in by Nick Groves-Rains Architects now, and he's kept the windows as they are. But this type of window actually does survive in mills and barns. So you do see them in farm steadings, in fact, in a kind of later form. But most of them have been replaced by sash and case windows. And so here's an example of a merchant's house of similar age and stature. And all of the original windows that we know of, the pre-1650 history of this building is quite unclear. But this building actually is interesting because it features windows from all periods, including 17th century sashes. And other than the very grandest buildings in Scotland, I've very rarely seen 17th century sashes with glass in them. And in this case, they were taken indoors and put in as lights above doors internally. And then the same architect that restored the previous building, this was his house, and he recreated some 17th century style sash and case windows in modern wood in the 1950s, but also there are 1780s and early 19th century lying pane, as you can see top left. Now, this house was restored by a friend of mine about 20 years ago, and I've worked on many of these windows with him. And we took them out, stripped them down, dismantled them in some cases, pieced in new wood where necessary, and then put them back in, built up in a way where they're a perfect sliding fit. And I'll come back to that because in my view, this is following on from what Marianne was saying about seals, draft proofing. I don't think you need to do any more than that to get a window that's very nice to live with. This is a window that's single glazed. In a house of this quality, you'd expect to retain all the windows, repair them, keep them as single glazed. And then by the 1930s, we're getting a greater variety of windows with improved technology, but actually the bulk of council housing in Scotland, for example, was built with 6/6 sash and case windows. So my message from that really is that from a Scottish perspective, we're 98% sash and case windows. And so that's why I'm writing guidance on sash and case windows rather than windows. And that makes life easier for us in some ways because we don't have casements which swing in and out other than in some romantic lodges on estates and things. So as Bill was saying, there's nothing to bang into anything else. So your upgrade options are much greater. Just I'll come on to the hierarchy of window replacement in a minute, but my experience of traditional windows is that nearly all of them are repairable. So this is an example which I saw where the owner wanted to replace them. And you can see these probably fall in line with what was being described yesterday of windows that were made from naturally grown Baltic pine or Canadian pine, very close grained, very hard. And you can see down to the sill, the windows are actually in pretty good condition. The sills make it look terrible, but they always do. And so my experience of windows is that they're nearly always repairable. And so this is my house in just outside Edinburgh, my old house, and I restored all the windows here about 10 or 15 years ago. But in a way, it's just to illustrate the pressure that we're under as a heritage body. My house was bought by a Danish stone conservator and her husband, and I thought it would be in good hands, but all these windows got ripped out and replaced with white PVC shortly afterwards. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'll go on to our planning guidance. Our planning team write guidance nationally, and it advocates a hierarchy that you'll all be familiar with, I think, which is that if the buildings make a contribution to the building, if the windows make a contribution to the building due to their age and originality, etc., and particularly if there's old glass in them, then there's a presumption in favour of restoring them and retaining them and restoring them, as mentioned at Northfield there. And in those cases, it recommends that secondary glazing is used so that the windows can be retained, the old windows can be retained. If the glass is modern, this is where things are starting to change, then it says that you can put in replacement glazing. So this is sort of slim profile glazing units, that sort of thing. Glazing upgrades, we call them. If the window is very rotten, then you can put in a window which matches in every respect, like for like, with the exception of a deeper check to take upgraded glazing if that's what you want. So anything other than anything other than repair and secondary glazing requires consent. Some planning authorities ask for consent for secondary glazing. That's the only area that there's inconsistency, I find. Generally, most planning authorities' policies, window policies, are in line with our guidance. They weren't necessarily written afterwards. Yes, so I'll keep going. And I was talking about change, and one of the things when you get to my age, you realize that the pace of change, and considering we're dealing with really old buildings, it's amazing the pace of change in thinking about old buildings. And I gave a talk on that in Cork last year. So 20 years ago, Edinburgh City Council had a complete ban on double glazing in listed buildings and in conservation areas. Now they're allowing alterations in line with those I've just talked about. That's glazing upgrades and complete replacement if the windows are either later modern or very, very rotten. And it's getting quite easy to get complete replacement now in Edinburgh. This is all relative. I'm talking about Edinburgh because it tends to set the bar, and a lot of local authorities of the type I've worked with around the country tend to look to them to see what they're doing. The other thing was that back in 15 years ago or if somebody had wanted to replace those first floor plate glass windows with to put back the astragals to 12 to 6/6. The council would have said no, that's part of the history of the building, and they've actually relented on that now. So it's interesting. So it's now possible to put back glazing bars. So it's interesting the way that thinking continues to change. So I'm going to skip over the all the bit about the science, but I will just talk about the various types of upgrade, which is what I was asked to talk about more generically, and my experience of them, positive and negative. I think I'll just skip that because that's been covered quite well, and that. So when I started out dealing with listed building consents, there were one or two firms that did traditional sash and case windows with double glazing. And there were only really a couple, and they were very, very chunky. And these were actually great for if you had a tenement building which had lost all its glazing in the 60s, and you wanted something that suited that was traditional looking, and because of the scale of the building, it wasn't really so noticeable. But generally, there was always a need for windows that were really more sensitive to the character of the building. So I'll just skip that as well. So I'll just go through some of the upgrades options in addition to new double glazing. So this is how we've moved forward. All things have been covered already, but secondary glazing is still our favorite. Any glazing that leaves the original window untouched. We're supportive of that. I think there's some work to be done on how much ventilation you want coming through the window on the outside, how much you seal it up. Interesting to hear that being talked about this morning. My view is that if you properly repair the windows so they're a smooth sliding fit and you can hardly feel any draft even on a windy day, but just very slightly, that's probably about right. So the downside of secondary glazing really is more obvious in Scotland, because so many of us live in tenement flats, and Scotland's towns and cities have very much a sort of apartment block based way of living that you don't see so much in England. So if you're 5 stories up, you really need to be able to swing the windows in to be able to clean them and paint them. And some of the older glazing systems didn't allow for that. And they were also very chunky, like that PVC one you've seen, but very, very effective at keeping out drafts, and incredible ability to cut down noise in cities. So we were all very excited when storm windows came along about 20 years ago, and we're doing kind of much finer secondary glazing to replace a lot of the really chunky things we'd seen. And then now we've got these systems like this one by Cocoon, which is same as Glaze and Save. Cocoon has their stand over there. They've just changed their name. This from Glaze and Save to Cocoon, yes. And in Edinburgh, owners of large flats with large windows, they love this polycarbonate sheeting. Again, it gets around any problems with having to apply for consent or fiddle with your windows. So there's two polycarbonate panels there, and they're popped on. I think the only downside there is the issue about where to put them when you want to remove them in the summer, and also just opening the window if something happens in the street and you want to lean out of the window. But I'm talking from experience there. Putting them in a duvet cover under the bed is a great idea. Next one, I'm sort of in a way, just running through the options. Gecko glazing, I'm not talking about U values though, because that's what's been covered. Gecko glazing is another option, good because you can open the window if something happens in the street. I think there's a bit of a visual impact here, especially if you've got very, very slender glazing bars like some of the ones in the new town in Edinburgh, 15 mil wide. But for me, this would be great for a bathroom, particularly where you want to have the window open quite a lot. I think it just raises a general question about the U values that are put forward. How relevant are they if when you actually take into consideration how draft proof the frame is? I'm not. That's the thing. I don't have an answer on. Maybe Nick Heath can comment on that. And then next is improved glazing, which are these. Is basically using installing new glazing units into the existing sashes. And these are generally slim profile double glazed units or vacuum glass. Now, slim profile double glazing has become very popular in Edinburgh. I thought it was really just something that we let people do if they had modern glass and they were desperate for double glazing. But actually the performance figures seem to be quite good on all of these in relation to just having single glazing. But I think it seems like a lot of work fiddling around with routing out individual sashes. I don't like removing any timber, just as Marianne was saying. I don't like removing any timber from a sash, particularly an enormous Edinburgh sash that's above a busy street. So routing out checks, it's very fiddly, very expensive to do, but some people are prepared to pay for it. I think the downside is at the moment there seems to be a lot of, there seems to be evidence that these units aren't lasting very long, and I know some early ones did fail quite quickly, but it would be good to know a bit more about that, really, because they are a good option in some cases. So we did a couple of studies. It's meant to be 2010 and 2013 on a building for a housing association, and we used 3 or 4 different manufacturers, or was it 4 or 5? But I think Nick will tell you about that. So I'm not going to dwell on that. I think the only point I'd make, unfortunately, is, of course, people always want products. They always want to phone us up and say, can you give us a product that you recommend? And we can't recommend products because of being a public body. But products are great because they help us find, or they help owners and managers find answers to problems that they have with their building, which can help them. But some of the manufacturers, unfortunately, I think 2 of the manufacturers that we trialed with here have gone bust. So again, more science, which I'll skip over because it's being covered today. And then I'll just talk a little bit about vacuum glass, which we seem to have had more. Sorry, beg your pardon, I haven't been going through the slides. That was slim profile glazing. Vacuum glass, which we did do a trial in Edinburgh. It's quite a long time ago now, 2009. You can see the little dots, or can you? It's always a debate about whether you can see the little dots now for where the vacuum's been made. These were featured earlier, and we also have trialed or done a trial with Fineo. Vacuum glass. It boasts 0.7 U value of 0.7, and we tried it in this building in the north of Scotland near Inverness, and it looks really good, actually. I thought it would look very chunky. It's about, 6.7 millimeters thick. But it's indistinguishable from the plate glass, old plate glass. This old plate glass didn't have any visual interest to it, which is why we tried it on this one. But I think the weight is an issue. I think the thickness doesn't matter looking at it. But I think when you're bumping up the weights in order to counterbalance the added weight to the glass, it's starting to look like it's putting quite a lot of strain on the pulleys and the ropes. So I had to pop in and replace a rope that had snapped just a couple of months ago. And also the cost. The cost is the other one. It's £1,000 a window just for the glass. So it's quite a serious financial commitment. 1 minute. Okay. I think I'll just... the problem I'm having with writing guidance, these are my windows in my latest property. These are absolutely gigantic. I only just come up to about here on this window. In fact, relates to what Marianne was saying, is that so as a person who writes guidance and gives people advice, I can feed people good practice, but in a way that's very abstract, because what you're sending them away is principles of best practice, what their options are, what might get consent, that sort of thing. But the reality of it is very different. And joiners either want to spend they want to spend as little time as possible on site and as much time as possible in the workshop, which is completely understandable. So the reality of actually being able to overhaul these windows in the way that I was doing on those previous properties, I can't do these because these are just far too big. Sorry. There was meant to be a picture of seals. I'm basically offered the option of having those windows upgraded with seals or brand new windows, and the cost is about the same. But the previous version isn't really fit for purpose in my view, and this is what I'm struggling with in the guidance, is because I think windows that we should leave people with windows that are fit for purpose. I'll finish up there. Seems like a good place to stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for coming all the way from Scotland and telling us about the policy and the guidance that they're providing there.